By the late 1920s, silent film had evolved into a highly fluid, visually expressive art form. Directors were executing sweeping camera movements, and actors had learned to convey complex narratives without speaking a single word. Audiences were curious about synchronized sound, but early attempts were strictly treated as short-lived novelties. Most studios were producing brief musical numbers or isolated dialogue scenes that functioned more like stage tricks than cohesive movies. History usually points to The Jazz Singer, released in 1927, as the breakthrough that ended this quiet era. But that picture was actually a hybrid. It was a part-talkie, which meant it relied heavily on traditional silent title cards to tell the story, interspersed with just a few isolated minutes of synchronized singing and speech. The true technological leap happened a year later, with a Warner Brothers release called Lights of New York. This was the industry's first all-talkie, a feature-length movie that utilized a continuous spoken soundtrack from start to finish without relying on text cards to explain the plot. The sudden public appetite for feature-length dialogue forced studios to rush an incredibly immature audio technology into theaters. The result was a violent collision between mechanical engineering limits and cinematic art. The dominant audio recording system of 1928 was called Vitaphone, a sound-on-disc technology. The microphones required for this system were heavy, delicate, and entirely unmovable. To get these large, stationary microphones close enough to record the cast, directors had to resort to hiding them inside conspicuous set dressing. They were frequently shoved into oversized flower pots or mounted directly inside heavy desk lamps. This setup dictated where the performers could stand. Actors could no longer move freely around. They had to huddle tightly around whichever specific prop contained the hidden microphone. The auditory penalty for missing your mark was severe. If an actor turned their head even a few inches away from the lamp or the flower pot while speaking, their voice would simply fail to record on the disc. This strict constraint was a massive downgrade from the highly dynamic, full-body performances that audiences had grown accustomed to watching over the previous 2 decades. The desperate engineering required to capture clean audio broke the art of screen acting. It stripped performers of their physical range, reducing highly expressive actors to terrified wooden statues clustered around a prop. The actors weren't the only ones trapped. The second major mechanical failure of early sound cinema came from the cameras recording the scene. Early motorized cameras generated a loud, continuous grinding noise. Because the new microphones picked up every ambient sound in the room, the mechanical clatter of the camera ruined the highly sensitive dialogue tracks. The studios engineered a brute force workaround called the icebox, a heavy, soundproof booth designed to contain the camera's mechanical noise. Cinematographers were sealed inside these unventilated spaces. With hot studio lights blazing, operators sweltered through entire scenes with zero airflow. Because the heavy booth couldn't easily be moved, the camera was permanently anchored to one spot on the floor. The elegant tracking and panning shots developed during the late silent era vanished instantly. To prioritize clear spoken words, studios sacrificed visual storytelling. The motion picture temporarily devolved into the static, rigid look of a filmed stage play. When Lights of New York premiered, the critical reception was brutal. Reviewers from major publications like the New York Times openly mocked the final product. Critics correctly pointed out the clunky dialogue, the visibly static camera work, and an almost total absence of the artistry that had defined the late 1920s. The public ignored the reviews. Audiences packed into standing-room-only theaters, mesmerized by the miracle of hearing continuous, synchronized human speech coming from a screen. Behind the scenes, the studio had produced this feature on a highly constrained micro-budget of just over $20,000. This chart shows the financial reality of that gamble. Against its initial $20,000 cost, Lights of New York brought in a staggering box office gross of over $1 million. That massive profit margin dictated the terms of the industry moving forward. It proved to executives that despite the awful reviews and technical flaws, sound was a permanent shift in consumer demand, not a passing gimmick. This specific financial victory sent a clear signal to every studio head in Hollywood. The highly developed infrastructure of the silent film era was instantly obsolete, and every lot would have to be overhauled for audio recording. Lights of New York itself is no masterpiece. It is a crude, gangster-themed melodrama set in Prohibition-era speakeasies, but it served as a technological battering ram. It demonstrates how leaps in established art forms are often clumsy, forcing creators to take massive steps backward in quality just to implement a new tool. The industry essentially traded 2 decades of visual refinement for a noisy, technically crude future that prioritized the human voice over every other cinematic tool.